What medieval European women had to use as sanitary pads every month were, in fact, things that today you would in disgust sweep straight into the trash. No medical cotton, no waterproof layers. They clamped a rough, slimy, and pathogen-ridden mass of materials against the most sensitive skin on their bodies. The more terrifying part is that these items were not thrown away. They were dried stealthily in dark, moldy corners and forced to be used over and over, year after year, even as their bodies screamed against the ravages of infection. Right now, as I unseal the truth about these haunting materials, you will see through a cruel, physiological dark corner a naked truth hidden beneath the skirts of the old world that history books have collectively silenced and covered up for centuries. Number 1. Menstruation was viewed as unclean. In most of medieval Europe, menstruation was not seen as a normal biological phenomenon. In many church records and folk beliefs, it was viewed as a sign of impurity, something to be hidden and kept away from the community. A 14th century peasant woman might wake up on her cold, damp straw bed and immediately understand that the next few days were going to be much heavier, not just because of physical pain, but because from that moment on, she had to start hiding her own body. In many parts of Europe, people believed that menstruating women could spoil flour, turn milk sour, or bring bad luck to the harvest. It sounds like absurd superstition, but for millions of medieval women, those beliefs directly dictated how they were treated every single day. Some places restricted women from entering the church during their periods. Some had to stand outside communal ceremonies, avoiding the probing eyes of villagers. Even within their own homes, many women were required to sleep apart from their husbands, because menstruation was viewed as bringing bad omens. The terrifying part is that they had almost no right to complain. The next morning, they still had to wear thick, damp woolen dresses and go out to work in the fields as if nothing had happened, while their lower bodies ached and felt miserable for hours on end. But all of that wasn't even the worst part. The real question is, how did medieval women handle menstrual blood in an era without sanitary pads, without stable clean water, and where even a piece of clean linen was a valuable asset? Because what they used to keep their bodies dry was sometimes rough, unhygienic, and far more terrifying than we could imagine today. Number 2. The first sanitary pads were actually just rags. The concept of a soft, clean sanitary pad with a waterproof layer and adhesive wings like today would sound like technology from the future to a medieval woman. When their physiological cycle arrived, they had only one option: utilize whatever was around them that had absorbing capabilities. And whatever here was usually far from pleasant. Look into the life of a 14th century European village. Fabric was a precious commodity. A linen shirt could be worn for years, patched over and over until it barely retained its original shape. No one threw away a piece of fabric just because it was old. Frayed shirts, worn-out strips of cloth, or moth-eaten woolen blankets were often stuffed into wooden chests to be reused for everything. And on those days, they became personal hygiene items. A woman would sit in the dark corner of her home, quietly tearing old clothes into small strips, folding them into multiple layers, and stuffing them between her legs to absorb the blood. If she was luckier, she might use soft wool or a few relatively clean scraps of linen. But for the poorest class, especially serf women living in remote areas, even an old piece of cloth was sometimes a luxury. So what did they use? They used whatever nature left around them: dried moss, soft grass, leaves, even clumps of plant fibers crushed by hand to soften them. At the end of the day, many women had to trudge to the edge of the forest or the fields, scraping patches of moss off rocks and bringing them home to dry. Then they would roll them into small wads to use as temporary absorbent materials. That was the sanitary pad version for a vast number of medieval women. And the problem didn't stop at the materials. Remember that the majority of European women at that time did not wear tight-fitting underwear like today. Beneath the heavy layers of woolen skirts was usually just a baggy chemise, with no straps or structures to hold anything in place. This meant that the rag or clump of grass was kept in position by only one thing: their two legs. The woman had to retreat to a dark corner of the room, bend over under the flickering candlelight, and quickly stuffed the folded cloth between her thighs. No leak-proof barriers, no adhesive, nothing to prevent it from shifting except the pressure of her body and the weight of the multiple skirts draping down the outside. From that moment, every single step became an agonizing, silent tension. Imagine the sensation of a wad of dried moss or coarse hemp constantly rubbing against the most sensitive skin on your body while you had to walk for miles, bend down to pull weeds, carry water, or work in the fields in freezing weather. It was painful, wet, and so uncomfortable that many women practically had to walk with their legs clenched all day just to keep the pad from shifting. And the greatest fear was always looming in their minds. Blood leaking out, a sharp bend carrying something too heavy, or a misstep on the slippery mud could dislodge the rag. The bloodstain would quickly seep through the thin chemise and imprint onto the outer skirt. In a society that viewed menstruation as unclean, this wasn't just a personal accident. It was a public humiliation. Because of this, many women had to live for days in a state of both agony and the terrifying dread of being discovered. But the most horrifying part actually lay ahead. Not the fact that they used dry grass or rags, but how those blood-soaked items would be handled after being removed from the body in an era with practically no concept of proper hygiene. Number 3. The most disgusting part is that they were reused over and over. This is where medieval reality begins to get truly disturbing. Today, we are accustomed to single-use hygiene products. When it's dirty, you throw it away. But for a medieval European woman, the idea of throwing away a piece of cloth after just a few days of use was almost unthinkable. Fabric was incredibly expensive back then. A linen shirt could be worn for years, patched up so many times it was practically unrecognizable. Even rags cut from old clothes were kept to wipe the hearth, patch blankets, or wrap food. In such a world, the cloths used during a period were almost guaranteed to be reused time and time again. And that is when the nightmare truly began. Imagine a peasant woman who had just finished her multi-day cycle. The cloth she used was soaked in blood and bodily fluids. But instead of discarding it, she had to find a way to wash it clean to reuse it the following month. No hot water taps, no antibacterial soap, no bleach. Only a wooden bucket, freezing well water, and a bit of hearth ash utilized as a makeshift detergent. Early in the morning or late at night, many women had to sneak those pieces of cloth out to wash in the corner of the backyard. They scrubbed rapidly in the cold water, rubbing vigorously with ash or fine sand, trying to erase the stains. Their chapped, freezing hands rubbed continuously against the stiff, dark-stained fabric, while their eyes constantly darted around in fear of being caught. Because what shamed them wasn't just the blood. It was being caught handling it. But the most horrific part lay in the next step: drying. In a society that viewed menstruation as an impurity, very few women dared to hang those cloths out in the sun. They feared the scrutinizing gazes of neighbors, feared the rumors, feared being seen as unclean. Therefore, instead of being aired out under the sun, which had the natural ability to dry and reduce bacteria, those cloths were often hidden in the darkest, most enclosed parts of the house, under the bed, behind the firewood pile, in the smoky corner of the kitchen, or hung silently near the damp roof where the air barely circulated, and the European climate was not forgiving. Winters were long, cold, and damp. Days would go by without a ray of sunlight. This meant that those pieces of fabric sometimes never fully dried in the first place. They merely transitioned from wet to cold and damp. The next month, the woman would take them out to use again. The once soft fabric had become stiff and tacky because old blood was deeply embedded in the fibers. Tiny green or white mold spots appeared in the folds. Some pieces even emitted that distinct, sharp, sour odor of moisture trapped too long in the dark. And then, on a freezing morning, they would place that exact material against the most sensitive skin of their bodies. The terrifying part is that many women of that era had virtually no other choice. They only knew that they had to keep living, keep working, and keep enduring. As for whether those moldy cloths could cause irritation, infection, or long-term illness, almost no one clearly understood. But even so, there was still something medieval women feared more than the smell of mold or the burning pain. It was someone else, discovering they were on their period purely by the smell of their body when stepping into a crowded room. Number 4. The odor during menstruating days. To understand the brutality of this issue, one must first forget the modern world's concept of a clean body. Medieval Europe was already steeped in foul odors from the start. Laborers rarely had the luxury of regular hot baths. The winter cold pierced the skin, and firewood was too precious to waste on personal hygiene. Thick woolen clothes were often worn repeatedly for weeks, becoming permanently ingrained with the smell of sweat and kitchen smoke. Peasant houses were low, dark, and stuffy. Windows were sealed with straw or animal skins to block the freezing wind. The air inside barely circulated, mixing the smells of coal ash, rancid food, human bodies, and the heat from livestock kept just beyond the wall. And then, into that space entered the blood-soaked rags reused over many months. When bodily fluids seeped deep into the old fabric but weren't completely cleaned out, the moisture and heat trapped beneath multiple layers of woolen skirts began to brew a smoldering, heavy, sour smell that clung tenaciously. It worked its way into every fiber, mixing with the stale sweat and unwashed damp wool. After a few hours of working in the fields, the woman herself could feel her body beginning to radiate that odor. And that was when the true terror set in. In crowded markets or during church services, many women barely dared to stand too close to others. Just an accidental frown or a slight sniff from the person opposite them was enough to strike panic that their secret had been discovered. To mask it, many stuffed lavender, rosemary, or aromatic leaves into the folds of their skirts and pockets. Some deliberately let their clothes absorb kitchen smoke to overpower their body odor. But these were all merely temporary fixes, because the smell was never the most terrifying part. It was just the first signal that inside those dirty, damp layers of fabric, bacteria and mold were silently proliferating, while the people of that era had absolutely no idea they even existed. Number 5. The infection started here. The concept of bacteria or pathogens was virtually non-existent in medieval European medicine. The majority of physicians back then believed illnesses were born from miasma, polluted air, or an imbalance of bodily fluids. Because of this, many women did not understand what was happening when their bodies began sending abnormal signals. The coarse rags, hastily washed in cold water and stashed in damp corners of the house, usually never dried completely. When pressed tightly under layers of thick woolen skirts for hours on end, they became the ideal breeding ground for irritation and infection. A woman working as a milkmaid, let's call her Clara, began to feel a burning itch on the 3rd day of her cycle. She still had to sit in the freezing cowshed from dawn to dusk, continuing to work as if nothing was wrong. By nightfall, when she peeled off the heavy woolen skirt, the skin beneath was bright red and blistered from constant friction. The stiff folds of cloth rubbing against her skin had created microscopic lacerations, but Clara had no other choice. She used yet another old rag, which had also only been superficially washed in plain water. A few days later, the itch mutated into a piercing agony. The damaged areas of skin began to swell, burn, and ooze fluids. Sometimes the cloth dried so stiff with blood and secretions, sticking so tightly to the skin, that peeling it off felt like ripping a thin layer of flesh from her body. And that was when the nightmare truly commenced. In the summer, the heat trapped beneath layers of woolen skirts made the damp, sour odor and the smell of fermenting body fluids suffocating. Inside the dark, thatched cottages, where rotting straw and dirty clothes piled up around the bed, lice and insects thrived everywhere. The already ulcerated skin became perfect targets for them to latch onto. Every step began to feel like sandpaper grating against flesh. Then the fever arrived. Clara lay curled up on her straw bed in the middle of a freezing night, sweat beading on her forehead, even as the wind howled through the rotting wooden planks. But she didn't dare tell anyone. In the society of that time, issues related to a woman's body were deemed shameful. Many preferred to suffer in silence rather than let a male physician examine their bodies. And in an era without antibiotics or sterilization, a small infection could sometimes last for weeks or even months. The tragic part is that this pain wasn't shared equally. Aristocratic women at least had soft linen, hot water, and better hygienic conditions. But for the impoverished working class, their bodies were left to fight against everything in total isolation. Even menstruation, a natural biological process, starkly mirrored the brutal stratification of medieval society. How much pain, how much infection, and how much humiliation you had to endure was sometimes decided the very moment you were born. Number 6. How did rich and poor women live differently? Even menstruation starkly mirrored the brutal stratification of medieval society. A noble lady in a stone castle could change into multiple layers of clean linen throughout the day, sleep next to a warm fireplace, and use perfumes to mask her body odor. Meanwhile, a peasant woman sometimes had to reuse the exact same rag until it practically rotted away. That was the gap between two living worlds existing in the exact same era. For the wealthy class, servants would boil hot water, wash the fabrics, and prepare draft-free bedrooms during the days when their bodies were most exhausted. But out in the muddy villages and impoverished working quarters, the vast majority of women had to fend for themselves with cold water, damp clothes, and old rags smelling of kitchen smoke. There were those who lived their entire lives never truly knowing the feeling of being clean during their menstrual cycle. But whether inside a perfume-scented castle or a mud-filled hut, they shared one thing in common: silence. Millions of women silently endured the agony and shame attached to their own bodies, leaving almost no trace in the history books. And that is perhaps the most bizarre aspect of medieval history. A recurring experience across generations, tied to nearly half of humanity, was erased from the collective memory as if it never existed. Number 7. What history rarely mentions the vast majority of medieval history books were written by men? Clerics, scholars, and monks scribing in monasteries. They wrote extensively about wars, thrones, and power, blood-soaked battles, political marriages, or kings who redrew the map of Europe were meticulously preserved on parchment. But almost no one wrote about the very mundane issues of the female body. No chronicles mentioned the damp rags washed in cold water in the dead of winter. No one recorded the smell of mold in straw-thatched houses, or the anxiety of young girls when their bodies entered their first period in a society that deemed it an impurity. That was the kind of pain that didn't start wars, didn't topple dynasties, and wasn't grand enough to be entered into the history books. But it persisted relentlessly across generations. Millions of women lived exactly like that, quietly washing old pieces of cloth, hiding their body odors, enduring infections, and continuing to labor as if nothing was wrong. No one wrote their names down, and perhaps that is the most telling thing about history. The past is not solely forged by kings or great battles. It is also forged by those who had to endure in silence, but whose endurance was too small for their era to deem worthy of writing down.